Hello everyone, welcome to the EUROSTUDENT Talks webinar. My name is Marlene, and first of all, I'm kindly reminding you that, as Zoom already said, actually this event will be recorded. And if you want to join in with your comments or questions, then please post them in the chat, or later during the discussion part, you are also absolutely welcome to join in with your audio and video as well. As you know, today we will be focusing on a very intriguing topic, how researchers are using EUROSTUDENT data. And for exploring this, I'm very happy to welcome here two Irish researchers, Myra Finn and Georgiana Myhat. Myra is a research fellow at the Graduate School of Healthcare Management at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and has been an adjunct assistant professor at Trinity College as well. Myra is a sociologist and has worked on topics of migration, including student migration, housing and the workforce, with topics focusing on quality of work and life. She has worked with EUROSTUDENT data since 2015 to produce a suite of papers on the experience of international and domestic students in Ireland, and will speak about this topic today as well. And secondly, we have here Georgiana, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Education Studies at the University of Warwick, and she is also a higher education researcher. Before joining the University of Warwick, Georgiana worked for Ireland's Economic and Social Research Institute. Georgiana received her PhD in 2019 from Boston College in higher education, and Georgiana started working with EUROSTUDENT data in 2020. So hello, both of you, Myra and Georgiana. And maybe before we move to some introductory questions, I would also ask our audience one question regarding their experiences with international mobility. And for asking them, I will launch a poll. I hope for active participation. Let's see, results are slowly coming in. Some people still answering. I will keep it open a bit, and then soon I will share the results. Okay, let's see. Most of them have answered. And here are the results. It's not like 50-50, but 60-40, and 60% of those who answered actually have an experience about going abroad as a student. I think it's a nice background for our discussion today. To start with, before we continue with the presentation, actually, I would like to ask some questions myself. And first, maybe I would like to know, why did you decide to use EUROSTUDENT data when you were doing your research?
Thanks, Marlene. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. So we started working with it in 2015. Myself and our other co-author, America Darmody, so she couldn't be here today to join us, but myself and America at the time had both worked in the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute. I had worked on the immigration of international students to Ireland with the European Migration Network. And then America, her background is in sociology. She did a lot of work on the sociology of education. So we had several discussions in the earlier years around international student migration. And then we realized that EUROSTUDENT data had never been examined before in the Irish context. So from several discussions, just wondering what were the experiences of international students in Ireland, and then looking towards the EUROSTUDENT data. We first worked with it across 2015 and 2016 for a paper that was then published for 2017, and then did another paper afterwards, but looking at immobility. And then this most recent paper was a collaboration then also with Georgiana, who joined the ESRI in 2020. And so from further discussions then as well with Georgiana and Marika, we've developed this next paper idea. But I suppose the motivation for using Eurostudent data, we realized it was there, it hadn't been looked at, but we were interested in the variables about student life experience. And so in the context of internationalization and the strong push to recruit international students into Ireland, it was guided by a national strategy. There was increasing numbers of international students. And some work had been done kind of by the national authority on the experiences of students, but it hadn't really been looked at outside of this jurisdiction. So we wanted to look at some other data sets as well, and knew that Eurostudent was there. It was a topic of interest, and then for the data set itself, that it had not been looked at. So that was it, and we've worked with it since, and probably will do again actually. I think maybe not next year, just a few commitments, but perhaps after that, because it's proven to be a nice data set to work with, and just as we become more familiar with the content and as it changes over time, we've been able to look at different questions. So that was how it started.
Yes, very nice to hear, and also very interesting to look into people's experiences, how they have been using the data. You slightly maybe touched this topic already, but why did you decide to focus on this exact topic, the academic satisfaction of international students?
It really related to curiosity with how students were getting along, because there was so much focus on recruitment. We just wondered what the experience of students were like. We did look at satisfaction in 2015, that was the concept we were interested in. We had developed it based on different questions within the survey. I suppose interestingly, this time around, we had wanted to try to extend that to well-being. So what are students' well-being? And how is their broader life, their friendships, their connection, their sense of self? But actually, we didn't really have this data within Eurostudent, so we kind of returned to satisfaction, and it's a very, I suppose, defined concept of academic satisfaction, so satisfaction with their academic context. So what we weren't really able to develop was this kind of really very broad concept of well-being this time. But we were happy enough to carry on with that existing concept. It's important as well, and it gave us a sense of how students were getting on in the classroom and such, and in their education institution.
Yes, I see. Maybe last but not least, because we are moving on to your presentation anyway, I know that in your article there is the definition for academic satisfaction as a term, but as here might be listeners who haven't read this academic article yet, maybe you can explain how you define this academic satisfaction in your research.
Yeah, I will go through it in detail in the presentation. I do have details about that within the presentation itself, but it's very much focused on the classroom, the lecture, and the experience within, I suppose, the daily life of campus life itself. So I'll go through it in detail within the presentation, but it is very much a classroom experience.
Okay, but then the floor is yours anyway, and for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Before I continue, actually, may I just ask Georgiana, is there anything that you want to add or anything like that? Just kind of quickly before I go on. It's okay afterwards. So, yeah.
No, everything looks good. I look forward to hearing the presentation, and I'm sure we'll have more conversation afterwards.
Thanks a lot. Can everybody see?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is based on the paper that we published earlier this year, the academic satisfaction of international students at Irish higher education institutions, and very much focusing within the Irish context. And so, as I mentioned, this is a collaboration with my colleague Georgiana, who's here today, and then also another colleague of ours, Marika, who couldn't make it. But the three of us worked on this paper, I think, across 2020, and it was published then earlier this year. So, yeah, so just to provide more context in the background, we had looked at statistics of international student migration into Ireland, and so increases over time, and looking at students from different areas as well, that we were seeing, data coming in about where students were coming from, with increasing numbers from China, for example, and from Malaysia, the US, Canada, India, and Saudi Arabia. So it's very increasing diversity in where students were coming from. And I suppose a motivation within this paper was really looking within the international student body. So in earlier work that we had done, we had just considered international students themselves by comparison to domestic students. But this time we were curious about the experiences of students within the international student body. And really, you know, given that students were coming from all over the world, how were all of them getting along as such within the academic context. And it was blended to not just with the academic literature, but also just even within in policy terms, you know, that there is a strong drive to recruit international students. This was guided by a national strategy in the Irish context. There's a lot of interest across the European Union too around how international students are faring within Europe itself. So, you know, there was a variety of moves, I guess, to examine what was happening with students. And so, you know, we were really curious to look at this data set and see like how students, how satisfied they were and what their experience was in the context of this push to recruit. There are very few students or few studies in the Irish context, and really nothing looking at students by region of origin. And so, you know, this was kind of a novel question for us to be able to look at how students were getting on and the diversity of the student body, most importantly. So leading to that, our questions were to look at the profile of domestic and international students, and then to ask whether region of origin predicted academic satisfaction among international students when holding academic and material context constant. So we had, you know, details on their academic context, on their material situation, and by region of origin that we had categorized these into global regions of origin. So for example, North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So as an example of the regions that we categorized. And then the last question was around the effect of cultural distance on academic satisfaction. So we looked towards some of the theoretical approaches around culture, linking it to kind of to the region of origin. And that, you know, once we had looked into the data set and that we wanted to look at where students were coming from in their region of origin, we then looked at some theories as well in the literature and how this had been examined in prior work. So that our last question then was the impact of cultural distance on academic satisfaction. So I'll turn to that next, just a small theoretical piece. You know, that we had looked and seen that there was work around kind of cultural origin. And in particular, I suppose, you know, while there's a lot of statistical studies, there are also more qualitative approaches, you know, based on interviews with students from particular regions. So any students perhaps from sub-Saharan Africa or students from China, and really asking them about their experience within higher education and when they move for education, and you know what particular challenges they might experience or face. And so while this was coming up in particular qualitative studies, you know, that there was very little, I suppose, that we could look at more statistically on what trends were emerging and what we could identify on a broader level. So that was what motivated us to look towards this particular theoretical approach. So I suppose looking to some definitions, the culture is defined as a set of values, symbols, beliefs, languages, and norms that guide human behaviour within a workplace, within a region, or within a country, and of course within an education context as well, that can emerge there. And if we ask what cultural distance is, that it's defined as a function of differences in values and communication styles that are created with individuals or groups to perceive that their values and communication styles differ from others. And this can contribute to understandings of diversity. So we drew on those that body of work to guide, theoretically guide this piece. So some theories around cultural distance, they do argue that country of origin may have a direct influence on student satisfaction due to differences between education systems and teaching and learning styles, and in facilities and resources available. So there is some merit in looking at this and using it to frame our work. So in Theorizing, we went to the work of Geert Hofstede, and he developed this model in the 1980s. So it is quite an older piece of work, although it is still used, it endures. Even though there are critiques and limitations to it, it's a powerful model that still holds merit today. And so if we look at this diagram here, it demonstrates the cultural dimensions of Hofstede's theory. And so he created this index for different nation states, for different countries, based on how he ranked them in relation to power distance, to individualism versus collectivism, to uncertainty avoidance, and to masculinity versus femininity, to long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, and to indulgence versus restraint. So we went with power distance and individualism versus collectivism within our model. And we ended up with 4 categories as such. So those countries which exhibit traits of a small power distance. So by power distance, I mean the degree to which, in an education context, the degree to which a student might recognise a great deal of power differential between themselves and between educators, or not, whether they view a more equal kind of relationship between students and teachers in the classroom, with students and lecturers. And likewise, where individualism is, a more individualistic approach versus a more collective group orientation within work. So we had groups where there was small power distance with high individualism, small power distance with low individualism, and then a large power distance with high individualism, or a large power distance with low individualism. So we there's a website, Hofstede Insights, where all of these country categories are, the information about all of them is available. And we went to that website and recoded everything, all of the countries, into the categories as stipulated by Hofstede, and used them within our analysis, alongside just countries grouped according to region of origin. And so I think our conversation might turn more towards this later, but looking at the student as customer paradigm, is that in addition to notions of culture and national culture, or cultures in particular regions, there's also this emerging, I suppose, culture of a student as customer, an emerging paradigm. And in our early work within this paper, we hadn't necessarily looked at this actually. It came out later based on our analysis of the data, and we went back to this literature later. But essentially, this emerging paradigm of the student as a customer, and arguments that perhaps as education takes on these characteristics and features, that perhaps national culture might not be quite so salient in the context of mobility and changes in education systems. And this move, towards educational consumerism, and that there may not perhaps be as many differences between international and domestic students in terms of how they perceive the value of their experience in higher education institutions. So that, perhaps the experience of international students are a window into the experience of all students, as we examine international students, that there are changes that are taking place for domestic students too. So, with this body of work, that perhaps we cannot say rely so much on a concept of national culture, or and this kind of notion of culture that Hofstede put forward several decades ago. And so there is literature still using Hofstede. There is an enduring, power within that model, but that perhaps we need to also take into account these other evolving contexts as well, with the student as customer paradigm. But also, I suppose, another critique of Hofstede's model is that culture is not just static, that I suppose as there is an evolution, and even more culture is comprised of, that his model doesn't necessarily take account of these evolving contexts and changes over time. So we need to be conscious of this when we use his work, and when we think about the context of what's changing within international education in general. Okay, so turning now to the definition of academic satisfaction, and picking up on the question that Marlene asked earlier on. In the literature, it's broadly defined as enjoyment of one's role or experience as a student. And that, I suppose there is a body of work that has operationalized this. It's typically measured using Likert scales. So most of the work that we found in the literature that had used this concept, it was measured using a series of Likert scales. And it has been developed later in relation to well-being and cross-cultural differences, so it has evolved over time too, but we kept more with this kind of, I suppose, quite compact definition within our current study. But it has been used over the years in examining how students settle in. And most recently, we looked at the study here by Neto in Portugal, published 2 years ago. And it is, taken quite commonly as a marker of how students are settling into their college life. Even though there may be other aspects, of course, outside their broader life outside the academic context, that would matter as well, or that might play a role as well. So specifically, going back to Marlene's question earlier, these are the indicators that we used to construct our variable and the definition that we used from EUROSTUDENT. So these questions, so students who felt their lecturer inspired them, and that they would recommend their current study program to other students, that they had clear expectations about what was expected, that they had satisfaction with the quality of teaching, satisfaction with the organisation of studies and their timetable, and then satisfaction with the study facilities, including the library, computers, building, classrooms, etc. So that was the definition that we put together and relied on within this particular study, and very much an academic focus. So that's everything in terms of the setup. And then to move forward, some selected findings, both descriptive and inferential. I guess perhaps if there's questions on the methodology specifically, we can turn to them later if anything comes up. But I guess what was important again was we looked at international students, but also, what's happening for domestic students came out as well. And, I suppose our initial intuition to examine within groups of students, there was merit in that, and that there were greater differences within groups of international students than between international students as a whole and domestic students. So we were able to gain some insight into what was happening for different groups of international students. So just some descriptive findings that, there were some comparisons between domestic and international students. So in terms of sex and gender, meaning the proportion of male and female students, that was comparable. The extent to which students reported currently experiencing economic difficulty was comparable, and the type of institution they attended. Then there were differences between groups of international students, but then other ways in which international students as a body were distinct from Irish students. So turning firstly to the differences between groups of international students, we see that female students, they were underrepresented among students from South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. And then that they were overrepresented among North Americans. And then if we think about financial difficulty, that this was higher among students from South Asia and from Sub-Saharan Africa than it was for other international students and for domestic students. And that students from the Middle East and North Africa, they were less likely to attend university than other groups of international students. But then students from Latin America and the Caribbean and from Sub-Saharan Africa were most likely to attend an Institute of Technology. And then moving on to areas where international students as a full group were quite distinct from domestic students. We saw that international students as a whole, they were generally of higher socioeconomic status than domestic students. So recorded with a higher socioeconomic status, and also to more, a greater proportion of them had mothers who completed higher education, so this indicator of socioeconomic status. But they were also overrepresented in those who received diplomas and postgraduate degrees by comparison to domestic students. But notably, I suppose going back to the student as customer paradigm, that across all regions, international students were less likely than domestic students to see themselves treated as detached customers in education. That was interesting as well, that if we think about internationalization and the concern with it becoming more that the student as customer paradigm increases, that actually international students were less likely to see themselves in that way than domestic students. So that was an interesting finding. And then some selected inferential findings. I suppose again, we, with the regression on what impacted academic satisfaction, the main outcome variable, that I suppose looking at some specific aspects, that it was those who experienced financial difficulties who had lower levels of academic satisfaction. So, seeing that finances across the board played a role in this. Also some regional differences, that students from the European Economic Area and from North America had statistically significant lower levels of academic satisfaction than students from Ireland. And then students with lower levels of satisfaction with their accommodation, but this also impacted their academic satisfaction. And this reflects some earlier work that myself and Mark have done as well, where we saw that accommodation was kind of a really strong predictor on student satisfaction. But then more broadly, after controlling for sex, for mother's education, and for having experienced financial difficulties, students from countries returning to Hofstede's categorization, that students with a small power distance and high levels of individualism. So small power distance, remembering seeing like not so much of a, I suppose, a differential between students and educators in the classroom, and then being highly individualistic. So students from countries with these traits, which included Ireland and which included North America, that they were likely to have lower levels of academic satisfaction. So this was the only group that we found a statistically significant relationship for, and I suppose it suggested to us that there was some merit in Hofstede's work. It didn't endure across all categorizations, but with this one it did. And so, we were able to see some aspect of his work still had explanatory power in looking at academic satisfaction and cultural distance. But the strongest predictor was the detached customer variable. And this was something, I suppose, we hadn't set out with this in mind, but once we had had looked at the data and done the analysis, it came out as the strongest predictor. And so that this really is the strongest predictor of academic satisfaction. So I suppose regardless of region of origin, any student who perceived themselves as being treated as a detached customer in the education process was much more likely to be less satisfied with their academic experience. And so the kind of salient piece was around whether students felt like detached customers were equal partners within the education context, and that this was the most powerful piece really, rather than region of origin per se. So while we did see differences according to region of origin, and we were able to see how domestic students fare as well within that, that really the most important aspect of whether students see themselves as being a detached customer or not. And just, I suppose, our conclusions and our recommendations related to the importance of partnership in the classroom context, and offering supports to students in that regard. So I'll leave it there. That's a short synopsis of the paper. Welcome any questions. And Marlene, I think I'll hand back to yourself.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Definitely very interesting, and also some surprising facts. And maybe, anyway, the discussion part is open, and all questions and comments are very welcome. But maybe I will start myself, and I would like to know if there was anything in the results that actually surprised you as researchers as well, that was like really interesting or surprising for you when you were doing the research.
Yeah, so I can take this one. Thank you, Mairead, for that comprehensive overview of the paper itself. I think there are multiple aspects of the paper that are somewhat surprising. First, we find that international students are generally more satisfied than Irish students, than domestic students. So this narrative that international students require additional supports, that they're disadvantaged in some ways, didn't really fit with the story we saw in this quantitative data, which was divergent from what previous studies, primarily qualitative, were telling us. That wasn't necessarily what we were expecting to find, but we know from other studies in the Irish context that, generally speaking, on quantitative data, international students tend to be more satisfied. But here, we were able to go a bit beyond that mere statistic and look at differences between regions of origin. So do we see this as a uniform finding for all international students? Are they all more satisfied, or are there subtleties about the groups that belong in this category of international students that would look different? And what we're able to show in this paper is that it's not always the case that international students are more satisfied. In the case of North American students, they tend to be less satisfied, but overall, they are more satisfied, although not always in a statistically significant way. So some of those differences were not statistically significant. The other surprising finding for us, for me, it was the finding that people that come from countries that have high power distance tend to be more satisfied. And this makes some sort of intuitive sense. If you're used to deferring to authority, to respecting authority, to respecting people that are older, perhaps, you're more likely to accept what happens to you. But you also see this in the data. So there is a subtle element that points us to the fact that perhaps academic satisfaction can be a function of culture in some form or sense. And what Mairead is talking about in the presentation is what type of culture is that about. But we do see a bit of a cultural nuance when we look at the effect of whether you come from a country with a high power distance or low power distance on your level of satisfaction. We see that makes somewhat of a difference. And of course, the biggest surprise is the strong association between perceiving yourself as a customer and being satisfied with your experience. I think that's a very important finding for higher education institutions, for people who work with students, who work with recruitment, who think about policies for this field. The more we perpetuate this narrative of marketization, the more likely we are to alienate students and disengage them from their student experience. And that was striking and surprising for me.
Yes, thanks a lot for your answers, Georgiana. I don't know if Mourad wants to add something or.
No, actually, that captured everything. I mean, you know, finding the third one that Georgiana listed was the most surprising, but even the second one in relation to power distance, you know, that was, thank you so much for raising that, Georgiana, because it's true, that was something that we also kind of discussed a few months ago and found interesting as well. And I think that captures it. You know, it was an interesting paper to look within the international student body and see what, you know, what came up for different regions of origin and such, but you know, really that broader piece around being a customer, you know, for us, just at the point where we discovered it as such, you know, within the analysis, we had a lot of conversation about it at the time.
Yes, maybe someone from the audience would like to ask something. You're absolutely welcome. Any questions, comments? People are still thinking about their questions, but actually maybe this is also an interesting point that we talked about this use of EUROSTUDENT data before. I would like to know what you as researchers think about the limitations in EUROSTUDENT data. Are there any nuances that should be added when serving the international students? Maybe some recommendations, like what should be there, but actually it's not at the moment.
Yeah, we have talked about this actually before, also when we were writing up the paper. And I suppose I'll say something first, and then I'll hand over to Georgiana too, because I know she has some really good ideas as well on how we look at student experience. But I suppose just to revisit what I said earlier about well-being. So I suppose initially that was the main concept that we wanted to start out with, you know, and really this kind of broader concept about well-being in one's life, and you know, how we can say something about that for students. So I suppose, you know, we weren't really able to find that data within EUROSTUDENT itself. And I guess it would be welcome to see that kind of in the future, you know, that you have this kind of broader, I suppose, kind of looking around friendships, you know, and engagement, and, you know, just like what is well-being, I suppose, for students and how that can be captured. But then also, I suppose, so this will, I suppose, introduce another discussion that we'd had before was around the concept of satisfaction itself. I mean, this was a concept I guess myself and America had kind of talked through a few years ago and then brought into this paper. And while there are a lot of studies that look at satisfaction, and it's of course of policy relevance, you know, we want to know from a policy perspective, are students happy? You know, how do they feel about what's happening academically? I think statistically it might not stand up so strongly actually, and I think Georgiana has done other work on this. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Georgiana, on that. I think it's interesting in terms of talking about like outcomes for students and how we discuss that.
Yeah, so going back to the question about what I would like to see in the EUROSTUDENT data, I would like to see a few more variables that capture things around the learning and academic achievement of students, maybe prior academic achievement or current academic achievement. Very often in higher education research, we think about outcome variables that would connect to enhancing the learning, progression, and completion of students. So those are generally the things we look for to think about questions of quality, to think about questions of experience, think about questions of inclusion. So we think about academic achievement, we think about progression, we think about completion, those sorts of things. That's very difficult to do with the cross-sectional data like the EUROSTUDENT is, even if it's repeated measures over time, but having some sort of metrics that would capture prior academic achievement would be very helpful. And I think going back to a point that my co-author here is making, I do think academic satisfaction, it's turning out to be a very tenuous variable at the point where it's influenced by so many factors beyond what an institution is providing, maybe perception of being a customer. It's very hard to know how much that is about the institution or the country you come from. And there previous studies, there are other studies that are now pointing out that even different items would have different predictors within the scale we're doing. So it seems to be a very tenuous variable. So it's hard to know exactly how much of what we can say about academic satisfaction is about the experience within the institution versus all the other factors that make people have certain views of their experience. So I do think that when it comes to policy discourse, when it comes to institutional changes, it's worth thinking about what other metrics can we use to look at the student experience holistically and to enhance that in an inclusive way.
Yes, very, very interesting thoughts indeed. We already talked about this feeling of being a detached customer, and actually we have one poll as well about what influences what, in that sense, that what you believe, how this connection between academic satisfaction and the feeling of detached customer works. And let's see what our listeners think. It's a long question, it takes time to read.
I guess I can offer some comment while everybody's reading it and submitting their response. Like, this actually comes from the paper. So when we discovered the connection between these variables, we couldn't really say anything about causality. And we had kind of surmised this in the discussion of the paper as well, but there was no kind of clear answer to it. And so I think in our preparation for this webinar, Marlene had asked us about what we thought the answer was, but we don't assume. Actually, we're not sure about this direction. So in that context, we thought it would be really good to ask the audience actually for their perspectives on this.
Yes, like third, okay, almost half of them have answered, but I will leave it open a bit still, because you also explained the background about it, and maybe they're still thinking. But it's actually interesting. I can already see the results, and it's interesting to see how people are answering to this question. Maybe last 10 seconds, and then we can share the results as well. It's like a classical survey, 60% participation.
Okay.
But yes, I will share the results. 10 out of 15. Yes, let's see now. I think it's quite interesting what came out.
I think it's interesting that 40% say something else influences both aspects. I mean, I don't know, is there anybody in the audience who answered that, who would like to comment on why?
I was also thinking that maybe those who said that they think that something else influences both aspects could comment what they think then, because it would be really, really exciting to hear about these ideas.
Anyone would like to come forward? Or you can just put something in the chat.
We are really welcoming active participation, so feel free to join in.
I'm surprised to see that. I thought that perhaps the majority of responses would be in the first two categories. It's interesting to see that. Personality traits.
Yes. Any other comments or thoughts?
So I will actually respond to Marius's comment in the hello Marius, and happy 1st of December, happy belated 1st of December. Yesterday was Romania's National Day.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to come on screen and share a bit more about your thoughts there, what personality traits might matter.
Hi, Martin. Do we need to unmute from our side, maybe?
You're muted, Marius. You have to unmute yourself.
Very well.
Sorry, I'm a little bit dizzy. I did. Can you repeat the question, or what you just?
The question was, why did you answer as you did? Or sorry, not why, not just something like personality traits. Would you like to say something more about that?
Yeah, I'm thinking that maybe there is some latent factor like that explains both this detached consumer attitude and the satisfaction. I mean, maybe the person is has this personality trait of, I don't know, looking at things in a more rational way or in a more detached way. I mean, it's not like this special attitude of or the profile, I don't know how to say it, of being detached consumer type is in itself an explaining factor. That's why. Yeah, did I make myself clear? Or?
Yes, at least you did.
Yeah, so go ahead.
No, Chuchanya, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, these are the sort of moments we're looking for in conversations because maybe they spark ideas for further research, right? But actually, the effect of feeling that you are a detached consumer held constant after we accounted for many traits. So it wasn't a function of sex, it wasn't a function of education, it was not the function of the country you come from, it was not a function of whether you come from a country that has a high power distance, so the deference towards authority. After we accounted for all of that, we still saw this effect. So that's why it's interesting to think about what else may explain this, because it's something that we have not observed, it's something that we have not measured, you know,
yeah,
in that
but
sense.
I mean, these are like, I don't know, social variables. I mean, this personality thing is more like a psychological approach, you know, and as far as I know, is not measured in the EUROSTUDENT questionnaire.
So it's like being an introvert or extrovert or those sorts of things. That's what you have in mind.
Yeah, some psychological variables, you know, like yeah, I don't know how to explain more.
But definitely, thank you very much, Marius, that you shared your ideas and the way how you see it. Are there any other comments or ideas from someone? Probably not, but anything else you, Mared or Georgiana, would like to add?
Comes to mind for a concluding statement. I'm not sure. I just thank you for this opportunity to present today. You know, I really welcomed it. I'm just yeah, like I think this paper kind of threw up more questions than answers. Maybe, you know, it was an enjoyable paper to work on. You know, we kind of, as I mentioned in earlier discussions, we had just looked at satisfaction, but once we started going into the theoretical literature, and even as I mentioned, when we saw the effect of this variable, then we went back to the literature on student as customer as well, you know, so we actually all worked on this paper in our spare time. Actually, we kind of, you know, we had other projects, but we were doing this kind of as a side piece out of interest, and it was a nice one to work on in terms of moving back and forth and the conversations that we had, like on what we could see with the data, and we went back to the literature again. But I do feel it has thrown up more questions than answers, actually, because there was a lot that came out that was really interesting, but that necessarily we don't know why it's the case, you know, or what lies behind it. So maybe there's more to look at for that, like in the future. And yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, like I think we will do more work with your student again in the future, probably not next year, but the year after perhaps. And just you know, it's good to discuss today, and you know, other conversations we've had about what we see and what we can look at again. But just yeah, I guess it's an evolving context. So going back to this kind of notion of culture, you know, and how it is quite static, like it is. The context is changing all the time. As such, you know, the kind of process of internationalization, like it is an ongoing process. You know, and I guess I do feel this paper, I suppose, has helped to show some of the aspects of internationalization that are emerging, you know, and coming up for students, all students, you know, in a changing education landscape, I guess. Yeah, I guess that's a conclusion comment from me. Over to you, Georgiana.
Yeah, thank you for having us today. It's always lovely to see and work with Mairead. So thank you for that opportunity. And thank you to everyone who's working on the EUROSTUDENT data and the EUROGraduate data, which I've had a chance to look at, and it's quite interesting too. We wouldn't be able to do this work if all those many people doing the data collection would not do their work. So we're very grateful for this exercise, and I personally think it's very valuable. So thank you.
Thanks to you both for coming and then agreeing to share your ideas about this topic, and also many thanks to our audience who came and spent this almost hour with us. And also maybe one little advertisement minute because of our next webinar. It will take place already in 2 weeks on the 16th of December, and it will be a kind of Christmas end of the year special, in that sense that we will welcome 4 student representatives from different countries, and they will share their ideas, what are the challenges for their student population in their countries, and what they are wishing for 2022. So it's kind of looking back, but also looking ahead. So I hope that everyone will come and enjoy this one as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marlene, for the opportunity to discuss this today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, and see you next time as well.
Bye-bye.
Okay.